All right. So, um, before we get going, just a couple logistic things before we start. After class today, hopefully this isn't too loud. You'll see the final Canvas discussion kind of posted, which is due at the end of next week, right? So the end of next kind of Friday. I suggested this Tuesday, but I would get on and get that done earlier rather than later. Don't save it till next Thursday or Friday. Get on, get that done quickly. So just like the other Canvas discussions, this will be, you look at the initial prompt. All right, I've got a couple different articles. Two of them have some data attached to them. You'll kind of respond to a couple of the questions that I kind of add in the prompt, using some of the data to kind of go along or support with the statements you're making. That's worth 10 points. And what else do you need to do for every Canvas discussion? Responded to other students. So what I'm getting emails about, I didn't know this has been the same for every single Canvas discussion, right? So the earlier you guys get on and get this done, the more their initial poster will be to respond to. So kind of getting this done early, I would highly suggest that. That'll pop up after my last section, so around 12:30 this afternoon. You'll kind of see that pop up. You'll also see the final kind of module quiz. So this is module 13 quiz. You've got kind of the practice problems that you can kind of go over just like usual. There'll be CL sessions tonight and Monday as kind of normal. I haven't had any leaders. They're all back now given the weather conditions. So no cancellations for this Thursday and Monday. I will mention next week, there are going to be some additional CL sessions next Thursday. We don't have new material, so they won't have a whole lot. It won't be as structured as the other CL sessions in the sense of I'll probably give them solutions to that practice exam, but if you've already worked through that, if you have additional questions, it's going to be more of like a tutoring session. You can go there to ask questions. They're not going to have as like, I'm working through these 10 questions, right? They'll kind of ask you for questions and then kind of answer them as though it's almost like a review session. So that will still kind of count as an additional opportunity to get extra credit points. So it'll just be like another CL session. There won't be one the Monday of finals week. They're just all too busy with their own finals. However, next Thursday, there will be kind of that additional session, right? And then the usual one for module 13 will be tonight and on Monday, okay? So we'll see those pop up. We'll have the last in-class quiz today. So what I've done on Canvas is, and I misspoke a little bit on Tuesday, so I apologize. Sometimes I get talking and I'm not listening to myself enough and trying to remember to do things from memory. I should have the syllabus pulled up. I've got it currently set to where it's dropping your lowest module reading. I think I told you I would do that on Tuesday. So what you see in the grade book for your module reading score, that is your final score in that category, right? What I've also done is I've got the quizzes set to drop your lowest two. Now, we haven't had all the quizzes due yet, so if you don't do the final one, that grade could go down, right? Because now you have a 0, that's going to be the one that gets dropped as opposed to your other two lowest, right? So after you take that quiz, that final quiz though, this will be set up so that it shows you kind of what your final grade in that quiz category is, right? And then after class today, when I get back to my office, we'll have all the in-class quizzes done. I'll kind of set the rule there. I drop your 4 lowest, okay? So after next Monday, after that final quiz is due, every single category, with the exception of the Canvas discussion, because that'll still be open, you'll know what your final kind of grade in that category is. And we talked about this after the last exam, but under the Files tab, and I'll probably post this under the final exam heading at the very bottom of Canvas, just so it's a little, it's pretty easy to find, but it'll be easy, also an additional place. This hypothetical grade tool, which if you open this in Excel, you just change these categories to what your score is in these categories that you see on Canvas. So module readings, in-class quizzes. And when I've set these rules on Canvas, it'll now be dropping that lowest module reading, lowest 2 quizzes, lowest 4 in-class quizzes. So those will be the grades that you kind of input into this Excel file, put in your first 2 exam scores. You can then play around with your final exam to see what would my hypothetical kind of grade be in the class. And then if you've went to CL sessions, you can kind of see what your current CL points are. I'll get those updated this afternoon. So it won't reflect kind of the next ones, but it'll reflect everything up to this point, right? So that'll be kind of changed, updated this afternoon. And then next week, once those CL sessions from this past week, I'll update them again next week, okay? As you're looking at those, once again, if you go on to Canvas by the end of, let's say, 2 o'clock today, and your CL points don't match what you think they are, you need to reach out to me as soon as possible. I haven't had any discrepancy. I've had a couple discrepancies here and there, and usually it's because of there's just lag in when they're kind of filling out the attendance. I've kind of made sure that they're doing this immediately after the CL sessions now. So when I update them, they should be completely reflective of the ones that you've attended. Okay. So I'll get that updated this afternoon by 2 p.m. So if after 2 p.m. it doesn't look like what you believe it should be, reach out to me and I can reach out to the CL leaders and we can make sure everything looks good. Okay. Other than that, I think that should be all the housekeeping stuff, logistics. So we'll have that in-class quiz today. I also reposted. I just changed the order a little bit just based off how we covered things on Tuesday's class. So the kind of slide file, if you downloaded it and you're using it, it might be a little bit out of order of what I'm doing today. The one that's currently up on Canvas is the new one. So they'll have a kind of the correct order. So if you want to pull that up on Canvas to kind of work along today, it has a slightly different order of the slides based off of how we covered things on Tuesday. Okay. I also will get an announcement, and I'll talk more about this on Tuesday. So first of all, next week, what are we doing in class? Just review, right? So I'll get another practice exam up. It won't have as many questions, so the final exam is going to have 30 questions. It'll probably have a few less, so somewhere around 25, but it's going to look very representative of a lot of the types of questions you see on the final. So I already have a practice exam up there. I'm getting hounded by people to have more. There's only so much time in a day, but I am going to get you a second one, so you'll have kind of 2 practice finals that you can review. Okay, that'll likely be posted sometime tomorrow morning. Okay, I also last night got the room locations, and so I'll get an announcement up about this, and it'll be on Canvas, and I'll mention it next week as well. I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head. I will have them for next week, but I do know that our exam is going to be in Hodge Hall. Right, so you're probably pretty familiar with that location, but we're going to be in, and it's going to be kind of weird. We're split between 2 big rooms that are right next to each other. So I think each one seats like 170 or something like that. And so we'll be right next to each other, but we'll kind of have two room locations that I'll kind of be in between. Okay, and I'll talk more about the logistics of the exam and kind of what to expect next week. But I just want to get that location out to you since I do know it. We will be in Hodge Hall. And I believe this sections were on the 1st floor. So any questions for me before we dive into material here today? I think I've got it. Okay. All right. So where did we leave off, right? So we kind of covered this last class. But we said, what is one similarity between perfectly competitive and monopolistically competitive markets? Because we have free firm entry and exits, profits always get driven down to 0, right? So in the long run, we know the price these monopolistically competitive firms are setting is going to be equal to the average total cost curve. Now, the difference was, we said, so even though we might start out with positive profits, prices above average total cost, as firms enter, what happens to the overall demand curve that the firm faces? Market demand doesn't change. You can think about it as there's still 100 people that want to buy this product. But if the number of firms go from 10 to 20, each firm is going to have a smaller portion of the overall demand curve. So their firm's demand curve is going to decrease, which will push that price down, until profits are, or price is equal to average total cost, profits are 0. And if we started out in the short run with price being below average total cost, we would have negative profits. If there's negative profits, firms will exit. If firms exit, overall market demand hasn't changed. I'm going to get a larger portion of the overall demand. So the firm's demand curve would increase, pushing them up from negative profits up until that price they set is exactly equal to average total cost and profits are 0. So we kind of went through this last class. We were thinking about profits end up being 0. In the long run, we end up with a demand curve that the firm faces. That optimal profit maximizing quantity, the profits will be set at 0. So I've gotten some questions here a little bit, and we'll review this, and I want to make this point. So if we're thinking about the long run, so I've got, here's the quantity of the firm. Here's my demand curve that the firm faces. Here's my twice as steep marginal revenue because they're setting the single price for their product. And I want here. So here's my average total cost curve. Here's my marginal cost curve. It kind of hits average total at its minimum point. However, the monopolistically competitive firm chooses the profit maximizing quantity where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. They then go up, set the price. Price is exactly equal to average total cost. So we said profits of the monopolistically competitive firm in the long run will be zero. Okay. So one thing we talked about last class was we can identify where the deadweight loss exists in this market. So this is where it gets a little bit tricky. Where would the perfectly competitive firm choose? Where supply is equal to demand, or where the firm's demand curve, their marginal cost will be the firm's supply curve. So we would be at this point out here. Okay. So when I was talking about identifying excess capacity, it gets a little bit tricky in that, and I will try to give you simple models and we work through review next week. I think you'll see I'm not going to try to trick you on this, but one of the practice exam questions, that excess capacity, last class I was kind of referencing it to that perfectly competitive quantity. It's actually going to be a little bit different. So even though this is how you identify that deadweight loss, right? It's like all those units, the difference between the supply and demand curve, all those units we weren't selling. So this is our deadweight loss. In the long run, where do we know the perfectly competitive firm would be at? So a perfectly competitive firm wouldn't face this downward sloping demand curve. A perfectly competitive firm would face what demand curve? Horizontal, which puts them at what point on the average total cost curve? The minimum point. So technically, when we're identifying excess capacity, what quantity do we actually know the perfectly competitive market is going to get to? So if this was a perfectly competitive firm, they would choose where supply is equal to demand. But the perfectly competitive market, if they didn't face a downward sloping demand curve, because they wouldn't, it would be horizontal, we actually know they would end up at that minimum point of the average total cost curve. So our actual excess capacity is, you can kind of think about it as that quantity that would put us on the minimum point of our average total cost curve minus the quantity that monopolistically competitive firm is choosing. So we kind of combining two things. The monopolistically competitive firm, they will choose a lower quantity because they can set the price, right? So that's going to result in a lower quantity, but they're also going to set a lower quantity because they don't face a horizontal demand curve. They face a slightly more inelastic demand curve or steeper. So there's kind of two things that are going to push that quantity even lower. And the actual definition of excess capacity is where that monopolistically competitive firm will choose relative to where the perfectly competitive market would result in that firm, the quantity that the firm would choose in a perfectly competitive market. Okay. So we're kind of comparing to that quantity where we would be at the minimum point of our average total cost curve. Okay. But when we calculate deadweight loss, we still calculate it thinking about if this perfectly competitive firm was making a decision based off of this downward sloping demand curve, where would they choose? It would be that point where supply is equal to demand. Okay? So it's a little bit different there when we're identifying deadweight loss versus when we're identifying excess capacity. Deadweight loss, we're comparing to where would the perfectly competitive market choose if they face the if they face the downward sloping demand curve. Excess capacity is comparing to where the perfectly competitive firm would be if they faced what we know is their horizontal demand curve. Right? So slightly kind of different comparisons there. Okay. So excess capacity, we're comparing to that minimum point of the average total cost curve. Deadweight loss, we're simply comparing to where supply would be equal to demand. Is that any questions on that? I saw a question over here. Did I answer it? Okay. I wasn't trying to be dismissive. I figured I'd get in there maybe by the end. Okay. All right. Everybody okay with that before I talk about the next thing? Because I got some questions after class from both sections, and I do want to clarify something because it gets tricky. Where would producer surplus be for the monopolistically competitive market? Well, anytime we're talking about surplus, it's the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal cost. What represents the marginal, what represents the marginal benefits to the firm? The price they're setting. What represents their marginal costs? Their marginal cost curve. So here, producer surplus would be this area here, right? Now, this is where it gets a little bit tricky. We have producer surplus here, but what are profits? So producer surplus and profits aren't the same thing. Here's an easy way, a simplified way to think about it, but for the sake of what we're doing, this way of thinking will work. Profits, I get a little lazy with my speech because we've always, after like module, I don't even remember, 2 or 3, we always talk about what type of profits. Economic, right? So economic profits are 0, but producer surplus, you can almost think about that. It's representing accounting profits. So remember, accounting profits don't take into consideration, I could take all my resources and join another market. So even though we have positive accounting profits, we have some producer surplus, we would still have 0 economic profits. There's no other industry where I could earn higher profits than I currently am. So that's why there's a little bit of a disconnect there, right? Economic profits are 0, even though we still have some producer surplus, because we can think of producer surplus as really representing accounting profits. Okay? Is that any questions on that idea? And I probably wouldn't ask you a question there, but I was getting some people confused on how those two things aren't, why isn't producer surplus 0? That's the reason why. Okay. Okay. So this was kind of our comparison of a monopolistic competitive market to a perfectly competitive market. We can identify deadweight loss. Okay. What is going to happen to consumer surplus? Well, we said consumer surplus is the difference between the marginal cost to consumers, which is the price, and the demand curve. So here was kind of our consumer surplus with a monopolistic competitive firm. If we had a perfectly competitive firm, that price would be lower, quantity higher. So what is happening to consumer surplus when we have a monopolistically competitive market? It's decreasing. Okay. So a little bit of, we talked about these concepts last class. I'm just going a little more in depth and talking about them to set us up for what we're going to do today. Okay. So we've got our deadweight loss. We can kind of compare those long run outcomes of a monopolistically competitive market to a perfectly competitive market. Okay. Now, I won't push you this far because it gets a little bit tricky. Everything that I've drawn for you so far, what do I always write next to demand? Firm, right? Usually marginal benefit, but this week I'm writing firm there because it's the firm's demand curve. If I really wanted to know where market demand was, what would I need to do? Add up the quantity of every single firm. So I'd have to tell you, this is the representative firm. They choose, say, 10 units. Well, if there's 20 firms, the total market quantity would be 200. I won't push you that far, but that's the idea, right? That would be the long run market quantity of a monopolistically competitive firm. So we know that they're always going to face a steeper demand curve than perfectly competitive markets. So we know the quantity of a monopolistically competitive market or firm will always be lower. The price they set would always be higher. Works the exact same way as if it just simply was a monopoly market, right? So we're kind of comparing these two. Notice that monopolistically competitive, even though profits in both of these markets, monopolistic competition versus competitive, they both have profits of 0. But the monopolistically competitive market is not at the minimum point of the average total cost curve. So what would we have here? The difference between where the market stops and where the monopolistically competitive market would stop and that perfectly competitive market, that difference would be excess capacity, right? And what is the minimum point of the average total cost curve? That is what we were calling the efficient scale of production. So I was going through earlier, when we talk about excess capacity, we're comparing it to the efficient scale of production, okay? So if I was summarizing this, I think I have a slide here. I'll come back, yeah. So we also talked a lot about last class, even though profits are 0, we also have that the price being set is above marginal cost, so we have a markup. Perfectly competitive firms, price is exactly equal to marginal cost, so the markup is 0, right? So if I was kind of summarizing this, I would think about the following, right? If I'm comparing these markets, I would have the quantity of a perfectly competitive firm is going to be higher than the monopolistically competitive firm, and the same would be true about the market. The price of a perfectly competitive firm is going to be what relative to the price of a monopolistically competitive market? Lower. What is deadweight loss for a perfectly competitive market? So deadweight loss is going to be greater for a monopolistically competitive market. Now, what if I instead think about a monopoly market, right? We can make the comparison we already have in previous modules to the perfectly competitive market, but what about a monopolistically competitive market? Okay. Well, if I'm thinking about the monopolistically competitive market relative to a monopoly, the monopolist faces the entire demand curve, right? Okay. And then their marginal revenue would be twice as steep. They've got the same marginal costs, right? So I'll try to draw a marginal cost. Let's assume that the costs of these two firms are exactly the same. What's going to be true about the demand curve that the monopolistically competitive firm faces? They don't face the entire market demand. What are they facing? They only get a portion of it. So we know that the demand curve they face is going to be less than a monopolist. Monopolist faces the entire market demand. Monopolists and competitive firms have to split it, right? So we know their demand curve is going to be smaller, right? It's going to be kind of lower, a smaller portion. So if we think about at the firm level, so this is kind of thinking about the firm, their demand curve is going to be lower. So at the firm level, what's going to be true about the quantity they choose? The quantity a monopolistically competitive firm chooses is going to be less than that of a monopolist, right? And we could kind of also go through, because they face a lower demand curve, the price they set relative to a monopolist would also always be lower, okay? So we can kind of compare across these different types of markets. Now, this one gets a little bit tricky. It's probably harder to see visually, but maybe the intuition will help a little bit more. Monopolistically competitive firms, although they still face a downward sloping demand curve, if I have, with a monopolist, how many substitutes do I have? Zero. If I have monopolistic competitive markets, there are not the exact same product, but similar substitutes. This is the idea. I can go to IU, or I can go to, God forbid, Purdue, or something like that. That's where I went, so don't be too upset, or don't make too many jokes. Also, the past Thanksgiving break was a rough one for me. But right, so we can think about, if there is more competition, what's going to happen to that demand curve? It's going to be more elastic, right? They have more substitutes. It's going to be flatter. So when we think about the deadweight loss, if it's getting flatter, closer to being horizontal, what's happening to deadweight loss when I'm going from monopolies to monopolistic competitive markets? Deadweight loss is going to be lower, right? Monopolies have more power. They face a more inelastic demand curve. They can get away with setting a higher price. So when we think about the deadweight loss that exists, it kind of intuitively makes sense. No deadweight loss with perfectly competitive markets, lots of deadweight loss with monopolists. Monopolistically competitive markets are going to be somewhere in between, okay? So this would be kind of just a summary table of kind of comparing those different markets, okay? Any questions on this idea? Okay. All right. So we've already talked about excess capacity. Kind of last class, we talked a lot about the markup. It's just that difference between price and marginal cost. So we'll start to dive into things that might be a little bit more than what I would expect to know. But before we do this, let's go here. I think I had this set to be, let's see what time I had this. Yeah, plenty of time. So I'm going to go up here. I think I have this set correct today, but let's check so I don't do this from memory. Yeah, the code today is 13.00. So we'll kind of return here. I'll get this published and we'll take a look at the in-class quiz for today. So hopefully 13.00, right, is a number that you guys can brag about after this weekend. If anyone gets my reference. If you don't follow the football team at all, then you might not get that, right? Oh, I see the light bulbs going on, right? So, really here we only have kind of one question, and we just discussed it, right? So which of the following is going to be true, right? So if I'm comparing a monopolistically competitive market to a perfectly competitive market. This is where you can draw the graphs out, and it is really helpful. But honestly, when we're comparing these markets, intuition actually goes a long way and lines up with the way that the graph. So sometimes we have counterintuitive results. The intuition here is actually pretty helpful when we compare markets. So if I think about a perfectly competitive market, right, there's lots and lots of competition. Who's that good for? Consumers, right? It means that companies don't have as much market power. So what was the whole point of when we had monopoly power? Companies were able to set higher prices, but because they were able to restrict quantity. So if I have a monopolistically competitive market, are they going to have a higher or lower quantity than a perfectly competitive market? Lower, because they have some monopoly power, right? So that one should be true, right? Now let's go through the rest of them. Will they be able to set higher prices than a monopolist? Well, if the fact that I had monopoly power allowed me to set higher prices, what market has more monopoly power? Monopolies or monopolistically competitive markets? So the monopoly is going to be able to set a higher, so this one's not going to be true, right? Monopolistically competitive markets will actually set a slightly lower price, okay? And then what about quantity, right? Well, if I have more monopoly power, how am I able to charge a higher price? I was restricting quantity. So the monopolist will actually set a quantity that is lower than what a perfectly competitive market would choose, right? We're comparing things now not at the firm level, but at the market level, okay? So that one's not going to be true. And then is it going to result in a lower price in a perfectly competitive market? Well, we kind of already said if they have some monopoly power, they're going to be able to charge a higher price. So the only one we have being not true there, the only one that we have being true there, these other three were not true, was that they're going to set a lower quantity than the perfectly competitive market, or the market will result in a lower quantity, okay? Now, the second question, you just get points for answering, okay? So any questions on that first one? Yeah. Yeah, so this is where intuition goes a long way, right? So what were we comparing here? This was the market, this was the different types of market, but we were comparing the quantities and the prices of the firm. Remember, in a monopolistically competitive market, we have many firms. So automatically, if we face a smaller portion of demand, what's going to be true about the quantity of a monopolistically competitive firm relative to a monopolist? It would be lower. But the monopolistically competitive market would be the sum of every single firm in that market. So because they have less monopoly power, we know that on the market level, the quantity of a monopolistically competitive market is going to actually be a little bit higher. They don't have as much monopoly power as a monopolist, right? So here, this was kind of our summary table, if it helps. And this is where I was writing at the firm level. If we compare things at the market level, that's where intuition helps us out a little bit more. Because monopolistically competitive markets, there's just less monopoly power, we know the market as a whole will end up at a lower price and a higher quantity than a monopolist would. Does that make sense? Yeah, so this was for the firm level. The question we were kind of working through is thinking about things at the market level. All right, so there's slight differences there. Okay. Any other questions? So I guess if you wanted a summary table, this might help as kind of review, right? Everything would work the exact same over here, right? The only difference would be when I'm comparing my monopolistically competitive market to a monopolist, the quantity of a monopolistically competitive market relative to a monopoly market is going to be higher. The price is still going to be lower. And then as a result, deadweight loss is also going to be lower as well. So the only thing that kind of changes when we're looking at the market level is that a monopolistically competitive market is at a higher quantity. But if we look at the firm level, we know the quantity has to be lower because they're splitting demand now relative to a monopolist. Okay? And the same thing would be true if we think about a perfectly competitive market. The market itself is going to be at a higher quantity than a monopolist, but each firm is going to be selling at a lower quantity, right? Because there's many, many firms as opposed to one. Okay. Any questions on that idea? But when we're looking at market or firm level, the only changes the things at the quantity level, prices would all stay the same. I mean, the directional changes of prices would all stay the same, okay? And then that second question, I just want to know which of the following modules do you want to see more review of next week, right? So I'll kind of have this in the back of my mind looking at the results of this in-class quiz. So the people who showed up, your opinion carries a little bit more weight. And so I'll look at the results and kind of try to focus or make sure I'm focusing on questions related more to the modules that people want to see more of. My guess is monopolistically competitive might be the one that you guys ultimately choose, but I'll have to look at the data. But it's basically, these are the 4 modules that we covered. Perfectly competitive, monopolies, the game theory module, and then now monopolistically competitive markets, okay? So make sure you're getting a response in there. There's no correct answer to this second question. Once you get that kind of submitted, I think I had it set to be, 10:15. So make sure you're getting that submitted here in the next minute or two, just to not worry about that cutoff. And we'll kind of continue to go through the rest of the material here today. Any questions before we kind of jump back into slides and additional material? Okay. So we have kind of these, we talked about excess capacity already today. We harped on market markups quite a bit last class. Let's think about kind of similar to deadweight loss. Well, if we have time, I'll revisit this. This isn't going to be something I necessarily ask as many questions on. So I'm going to skip down instead to something I have the exam written, so I likely know I will ask a question on this. But let's think about, if I'm in a monopolistically competitive market, what might I do to differentiate my product? So if I think about things like, I don't know, fast food hamburgers, I don't know. To me, they're like all the same, right? I mean, McDonald's or Pepsi and Coke. It's like, you look at the ingredients, it's almost the exact same product, right? However, what do they try to do to convince you that their product is different? Anytime you watch TV, anytime you look on any website, there are ads, right? They're trying to get you to know their product is different from all the other ones, right? Car companies do the same thing. Their car is unique, and there might be differences, but they're really trying to make you know that their product is different because of this, right? So if we think about advertising, right, we're going to kind of have 2 kind of things going on. So I'll draw out kind of the models, and then we'll talk a little bit more intuitively about it. And I think as we go through the models, it'll be easy to think about the intuition. So let me make sure I've got to burn through my markers here at the end of the semester. So the first thing that we want to think about, let's say originally I was in a market, and let's think Coke and Pepsi. All the products are pretty similar substitutes. Not the exact same product, but close. So if that was true, my demand curve at the firm level would be relatively what? So if I have a lot of close substitutes, if they were perfect substitutes, what type of market would we have? Perfectly competitive. My demand curve would be horizontal. Maybe this is an easy way to think of it. Instead of thinking about, oh yeah, when the slope is steeper, it's more or less inelastic, I always forget. A perfectly competitive market has a flat demand curve for the firm. Perfectly competitive would be perfectly elastic. They're the exact same product. So if we start to go to a monopolistic competitive market, if I have something like Coke and Pepsi, not perfect substitutes, but close, my demand curve is going to be relatively flat, right? And so if I think about my marginal revenue curve is going to be twice as steep, right? We'll think about this being the first scenario. Here's my marginal cost curve, right? Let's think about Let's go to here. We'll think about an extreme scenario where first, my average total costs are here. So where's the optimal quantity for the firm? Where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. We then go up here. We set the price. Price is below average total cost. So what's going to be true about profits in this first scenario? They're negative, right? So when I advertise, right, what am I able to do? I gain on two dimensions. If I can convince people my product is more unique, what might happen to the demand curve? So it's going to do two things. The first is that if I convince more people my product is better, I'm going to see what portion of the pie am I going to get? A larger portion. So my demand curve is going to increase. Not only that, what's going to happen to the steepness? If I can convince people my product is unique, there's no other product like it, my demand curve is going to become more inelastic or steeper, right? So our new demand curve is going to increase. Not only that, it's going to become steeper. So if I now think about where does this new demand curve, because I advertised, I was able to convince more consumers to buy my product, and that I was able to make my product more, or demand for my product more, inelastic. Notice what implications is that going to have? Well, the quantity I'm selling is going to go up, potentially, right? I wouldn't ask you what's happening in terms of the quantity, because technically, if I have more inelastic, that could actually push quantity a little bit down. But here we'll kind of focus just on price, which is what I would expect you to kind of know, right? So what's happened to the price that I'm going to set? Well, if I have an increase in demand, that increases the price. If I have an increase, in the inelasticity, that's going to increase the price. So we definitely know through advertising, we're going to end up with a higher price. What's now true about my price relative to average total costs? It is greater, so my profits are now positive. This is why firms advertise, right? I'm able to get a larger slice of the pie, increase my firm's demand curve, and I'm also able to have more monopoly power. So when I have more monopoly power, what happens to the price I'm able to set? It's even higher, right? And more monopoly power is really just saying I'm making the demand for my product more inelastic, right? I'm eliminating substitutes in the people's minds, that there's nothing else that is really a substitute for this product. So hold off on that. You're thinking about it the right way, right? So this is the first thing that we're going to see happen, right? So what ultimately did this do? Well, here, increase the quantity. We technically don't know if that's going to happen. It would really depend on like how much of like, did I see a 1% increase in market share or a 10%, right? But we know that the price is going to go up, and we know that it's going to drive profits up as well. So here is the first impact on profits of advertising. Seems like it's a really good idea, right? Well, this is where I don't want to have too many things going on in the same graph. We'll kind of look at each individually and then combine the two. So what do I have to do in order to advertise? So let's just assume for a second that when I advertised, so I had that same pretty flat demand curve, marginal revenue is here, I've got my marginal cost, and I think we started out with negative profits, just to kind of make this point. And we had the initial quantity, the initial price. Price was below average total cost, so profits were negative. All right. So I'm a company, I'm like, I'm going to advertise, right? It makes a lot of sense. It's going to increase my profits. What did I not factor in? What does advertising do? Increases my costs. But here is where it gets a little bit unique. When I advertise, if I sell 100 units or if I sell 1,000, what is true about the cost of my advertising? It's exactly the same. What is advertising? Fixed cost. So is my marginal cost curve going to change at all? No. But what will shift? What includes my fixed costs my average total, right? I should have used red here. I apologize. Right? Easier to see. So notice, what were my profits before? Visually, right? We can kind of connect the equation to our visualization. It's the difference between price and average total cost, right? That's the height of my rectangle, times the quantity I'm producing, which is always the width. So before, here were my profits, but remember, we said these profits were negative, so this was like the size of my losses. If when I spent money on advertising, let's assume that it had no impact, like everybody is advertising. That was one of the game theory outcomes we got, that it's Nash equilibrium, that everybody spends money in advertising. If everybody spends money in advertising, it's all equally as effective. What happens to our demand curve? Doesn't change at all. So if I've spent more money and the demand curve doesn't change, what's happened to my profits? Now the difference, I drew this very extreme, by the way, but now the difference between my price and average total cost, I'm still selling the same quantity. My marginal revenue, my marginal cost curves didn't change. What have I done? I have decreased my profits, right? They're a larger negative value, right? So if spending money on advertising, right, has no impact on my demand curve, what is definitely going to happen? I'm going to see that my losses are higher. I've just spent more money to sell the same number of units at the same price. Now, we know that when I spend money in advertising, it likely is going to change that demand curve to a degree, but what would essentially, you can think about, so we've got the effect of advertising from that demand increase is that it pushed profits up. However, the fact that I was increasing my average total cost, that effect was driving profits down. So if I think about what is my total effect, what's the answer? Indeterminate, right? It depends on how much more of demand I was able to get relative to how much money I could spend, right? So what should firms look to be doing? I want to be having really effective marketing techniques, but I also want to make sure that I'm not spending a lot of money. So why do we see a lot of companies now, especially smaller companies, aren't spending money like on these huge, a Super Bowl ad time slot is like, I don't even know what the cost is. It's millions of dollars, right? What's a really low cost way to advertise? I don't know. Online, there's a lot of like really low cost opportunities where if I know my consumer base, for example, let's say I was, what do you guys like right now? Well, this is like all social media, right? They collect data on who is buying their product. They then run targeted ads for a pretty low cost to people they know might be more likely, if they see an ad, to want to buy their product, right? They can keep costs low, but get an overall higher portion of the overall demand curve. They can make sure that demand increase effect is larger than the increase that they had to spend under fixed costs for advertising, right? So the advertising question, is it going to increase or decrease profits? The result or the final answer would be, we can't determine, right? We need to know something about the size of the cost of advertising relative to the size of that shift in demand, okay? So advertising kind of has these two effects. It takes money to spend, to do things on takes money to run these ads. And as a result, maybe that demand increase isn't worth it, right? Because if we're all spending money on ads, everybody's increased their costs, but what has happened to the overall portion of demand I get? Unchanged, we know that the profit of every firm would go down. We end up with a Nash equilibrium where everyone's advertising, whereas if they all chose not to advertise, their profits would be smaller losses in this example. So we would have an example of a prisoner's dilemma, right? We can kind of connect all these topics we've been talking about, okay? Any questions on, and what I would do if I'm thinking about something like this with advertising, I would draw out each effect individually. Because if you draw them on the same graph, depending on how you draw it, because the answer is indeterminate, you could draw it in a way where profits go up or profits go down, right? But if you draw each impact that advertising would have, the demand increase and the increase in cost, then you can kind of see, oh yeah, these are pushing profits in the opposite direction. The answer is, I don't know what the total effect is going to be. Okay? It's kind of like when we had supply and demand simultaneous shifts, right? Any questions on anything here? Okay. So it gets probably a little bit more complicated, right? So if we think about advertising, this was one more point I want to make before I discuss it. Let's just assume for a second, let's say I started out with a relatively flat demand curve. Here, the firm would choose a quantity where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, set the price for their product up here, right? So what is true about my markup? My markup is my price relative to marginal cost. Let's assume that just for a second, I was able to not get a higher portion of the overall demand curve. Well, if I just was able to get a higher portion and not change the elasticities, right? What's going to happen to my markup? So instead of like drawing a difference in the slope like I did back here, let's just assume that I get a higher portion of overall demand. Haven't changed the elasticity for my product, right? So there's still, I haven't convinced consumers that the other substitutes aren't any more or less equally as high of quality or whatever it is, but I've just gotten a higher portion of the pie, right? More people have seen my product, they know it exists, than some of these other available substitutes, right? So if that's the case, because that increase in demand, you can kind of think about it as what's that markup really based off of? That difference between my demand curve and marginal revenue curve. Because the quantity I choose is where marginal cost hits marginal revenue, I then go up to the demand curve. So when I'm looking at higher quantities, what's happening to that difference between the demand curve and the marginal revenue curve? It's getting larger. So if I can get demand to increase, what do I know is going to happen to my markup? Well, that new quantity, this would be my marginal cost. I go up to my new demand curve to set the price. What's happened to the size of my markup here? It's increased. Because I know if I can get a higher portion of the overall demand curve, I'm going to be choosing a higher quantity. And at higher quantities, even if I don't change the elasticity, like I try to draw these parallel, at higher quantities, what's happening to the gap in between demand and marginal revenue? It's getting larger, which essentially, if I'm choosing the quantity based off where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, then the difference between the demand curve and marginal revenue, demand is how I'm setting price, that difference between price and marginal cost is going to be getting higher. So even if I am not able to change the elasticity of my product, but I simply get a higher portion of the overall demand curve, what's happening to my markup? It is increasing, right? So there we can kind of think about when we're advertising, we're getting a higher portion of the overall demand curve. We know the markup of the firm will also increase. Yeah, so let's say, I'll give you a good example. Let's say we think about bottled water, right? It's all the same, right? But what do a lot of companies do in their ads? They have someone that they think people like use their product so that it convinces people that the only water that's worth drinking is Aquafina, right? I make it so that, what have I done? I've convinced consumers that there are no other substitutes. If there aren't any other substitutes, what's going to happen to demand? All the way back in module 4, the fewer substitutes I have, the elasticity of the demand will become more inelastic. So I'm convincing consumers my product is more unique. There is no other substitute, right? If you want to be cool, the only thing that you should be wearing is this, right? Or the only product, you're going to be a lame old unless you have an Apple phone, right? Like that's what they try to convince you of with their ads, right? Now they might target different consumer bases based off of that, right? But they are trying to convince you that there's no other substitute for you to use other than their product. What does that do? changes the elasticity of the demand curve. So that's where that would come from. Now, simply getting eyeballs on my product, letting more people know it exists, that's going to shift the demand curve, right? So if I think about like locally, I would think about local ads are probably more focused on increasing just the demand curve for their products. So like billboards, you know, Joe's towing service is just trying to make you aware that Joe's towing service exists, right? And that you call them and they're just increased. They're not trying to necessarily convince you with that they're the only towing service. Typically, when we think about those changes to the demand elasticity, usually that's going to be something like in TV ads or something where they're trying to convince you this is you already know that Coke exists, right? So what do they try to do in their ads? They try to convince you it's different from Pepsi, right? So I would maybe think about advertising really as two effects. One, it's going to shift my demand curve by just simply making people know my product is available. Now, once I get to a level where everyone knows my product, everyone knows McDonald's hamburgers, everybody knows about Pepsi, what am I then running my ads? I'm not going to like get a higher portion of the overall pie. Everyone who exists knows that Pepsi is a thing. So what am I trying to do with my ads if I'm a larger company? I'm probably trying to convince people I have a really unique product and changing the slope of my demand curve. Is that what you're at? Yeah. So I'm trying to kind of give you some concepts. I know 252, you start to go through this, so it'll kind of set you up pretty well. And most of you, I expect you're staying in Kelly, you'll have to take 252. So they'll kind of revisit monopolistic competitive markets. So try to give you a little bit of a leg up. We're also starting to dive into issues that are probably a little bit more complex, right? I would maybe expect you to kind of be able to think about what advertising's effects on profits would be. But some of these other questions are a little bit trickier, right? Because ultimately, a lot of the answers are going to be indeterminate. Depends on how much I was able to shift demand, how much I was able to change the elasticity, but we can think about what those impacts would be, right? So that's why there's a lot of disagreement in terms of is advertising actually worthwhile, right? Even by economists, right? So we know that what might some critiques be, right? So if I spend all this money on advertising, what's one thing that's doing? It's just if everybody advertises, nobody's getting any more of the overall demand. Everybody knows these products already exist. What's happening to social welfare? We're taking money away from other things to just spend it on advertising, which is having no effect. So social welfare would go down, right? So that would be kind of one thing. Now, another argument could be that we actually, through advertising, what my marginal benefit of a product is, my actual demand curve, I might give people information that misleads them, right? So when I'm looking on Temu and they give me an ad that comes through on some site I'm on, they make this product look like it's awesome. I then buy it, I get it in the mail, and I realize this is shit, right? And so, we might incorrectly through advertising make people believe the marginal benefit is higher of this product than it actually is, which means people are going to buy more than the optimal amount, which would decrease total welfare, right? So that would be kind of another critique that we have is it's that making people think their demand curve is one thing when in reality it's something else, okay? If it prevents competition, so if we think about if I wanted to start a soda company, why is that going to be really difficult? Am I ever going to have the resources to compete with Coke and Pepsi in terms of advertising? No. So the fact that advertising exists, what is that going to create? Barriers to entry. What is that going to be more likely to then cause? Monopolies or monopolistically competitive markets relative to perfectly competitive markets, which we know will cause deadweight loss, right? Or a loss of total welfare, right? So, advertising, we kind of already drew these out, looks like it's pretty bad, but there is some defense, right? So, even though firms could mislead consumers, make them think the marginal benefit of their product is actually higher, it could also make consumers aware that this product even exists, right? Whereas before, maybe I didn't really realize the value of this product. The ad made me realize, oh, that would actually bring a lot of value to my life. So it could go the opposite way as well, right? Instead of misleading consumers, advertising could actually let consumers know, no, this product that you're not buying would actually provide you with a really high level of marginal benefit or marginal utility, right? And if we have more information as consumers, right, what is that creating amongst firms? More competition for us to buy their product. More competition pushes us closer to the perfectly competitive outcome, which would result in what? Higher quantities, but also what do we care about with society? Total surplus, right? So if this information is accurate, advertising could actually increase total surplus, right? By reducing market power. So there was a study once where they looked at, it's kind of interesting. So they looked at states. I don't know why this exists. I don't know enough about this particular kind of topic. But some states, for some reason, had prohibited, and I think they do this with like medical companies. Most states, all of them, don't allow like medical providers to, or at least they used to not let medical providers run like state level ads. So they had a similar thing with eyeglasses. And they found that in the states where eyeglasses were more expensive, they actually prohibited advertising. So if they didn't allow advertising, that resulted in higher prices, right? Well, when we had advertising, this was actually a defense of it, right? That somehow when eyeglass makers were able to advertise their product, it must have been making consumers more aware that there were multiple companies they could buy from, increased competition, which if we have more competition getting closer to the perfectly competitive outcome, what will that do to the price? Lower it. Who is that good for? Consumers. So these states, not saying they did this intentionally, but by prohibiting advertising, who are they actually helping out? So prohibiting advertisement resulted in higher prices, so they're actually helping out the eyeglass companies. I'm a bit of a cynic when it comes to politics. I'm guessing there might have been some people doing some favors to some of their friends, right, in the eyeglass kind of market, knowing that if we don't allow these smaller companies to run ads, no one will know they exist. They won't even know that there's other companies they could buy their glasses from. Right? Now, this is an old study. Most people wear contacts even now. But this is kind of an interesting idea. I'm going to skip ahead here a little bit just for the sake of time. What did I have in here? Is there anything worth mentioning? I think we've probably already talked about most of this. Yeah, we've already talked about all this. So one thing that is interesting, instead of advertising, if we think about this through branding, right? So when I create brand names, right? If I can get a celebrity endorsement for my brand, right? Let's say I didn't have to pay for it. So this happens all the time. Like they'll catch, just saw something. Was it like Bradley Cooper or Keanu Reeves? Someone, I saw something on social media was like, still drives a 2004 Toyota Tacoma. Do you think Toyota liked that ad or liked that? Hell yeah. They didn't have to spend any money. And what does that do for their product? Gets the name out there, makes people think they have a high quality product. So what would it do to their demand curve? Increase it, and they didn't have to spend any money. So then back to the question earlier, if I can increase demand, we know that's going to increase profits. But what happened to my cost because of this? Nothing at all, right? So if I can get somehow celebrities to use my product, or I can simply create a brand, right, that I don't even have to spend money to advertise for. I just create a brand that is somehow socially accepted as the it brand. If I don't have to spend any money to do that, my costs don't change, but I can get a higher portion of demand. What do I know is going to happen to my profits? They're going to go up, right? So this is why companies will send free items. What is the cost to sending celebrities my product? Pretty low relative to the other operational costs of a large company. But if these celebrities are seen using my product, what could happen to my demand curve? Could increase a lot, especially if this is someone who's really popular, right? I even think about this as like with sports teams, right? They will try, like Adidas and Nike. Like Nike was like an innovator of this, I think, with Oregon, and they like provided them all of their uniforms, things like that. Because in every game you watched Oregon play, what did you see? You saw the Nike symbol. You heard them mention that Nike had this deal. Well, that's a pretty low cost to just giving this team uniforms relative to like the operational costs of the entire company of Nike. So very small increase in costs, which we know is going to decrease profits. But if I now got all these eyeballs nationally on my product and they think, oh, if it's good enough for these Division I football programs, it's good enough for me, what's going to happen to the demand curve? It's going to increase a lot, right? So if you're thinking in a business mindset, I know that sometimes in this course throughout the semester, it's probably gotten lost. We get lost in the weeds of like how these models work. But ultimately, we've arrived at a point where this is what companies are trying to do, right? We're trying to use these economic principles, what we know about different types of markets, obtaining monopoly power, how increasing fixed costs will change our profits to ultimately make really good decisions of how we're going to advertise. How do I want to, make sure, am I putting a significant amount of money into creating a brand that is perceived as high quality, right? And this is where it doesn't even have to be that I'm creating a high quality product. This is what, and I probably say it wrong. I feel like you guys like snicker every time, but Temu, or however the hell you say it, right? They have found a way where they are spending very low amounts of money to get their products out to you and make you think they're high quality. And that's all that matters. If you think it's high quality, that's it, right? You're going to make your decision based off of that, right? Now, over time, I'm guessing that model is going to kind of backfire on them. But if I can make short-run profits and then close down in the future, maybe I'm okay with that. So this kind of idea of brand names, I don't want to waste kind of too much time on it. It's just kind of an interesting topic. I think about, when we're talking about monopolies in competitive markets, and brand names, things like that, are really honing in on this fact that I can get a larger slice of the pie, increase demand, or increase the inelasticity of my demand curve without spending really any additional money, right? So that's why brand names as opposed to advertising is a little bit more of an interesting kind of scenario, because that's what companies ultimately, that's their goal. Spending no money, but getting a higher portion of the demand. Because most markets, I try to give you examples throughout the semester of monopoly markets or perfectly competitive markets. But even something like gasoline, that's my go-to example, right? 87 unleaded gasoline. What does Circle K try to convince you? That when you go to their gas station to get gas, that all of the other products they sell are better, right? Right, that they have, you can stop there and they've got a rewards program. Oh, okay, that's better for me. Oh, you can get 2 for $4, whatever crappy food they sell, right? Or I can get an 89-cent. They try to convince you all of the other benefits from the experience of stopping at their gas station is different from every other. What does Wawa do? It's the same thing, right? It's still a gas station. They might have additional things you can buy. The product that they're selling really hasn't changed. They're trying to convince you that the rest of the experience at their company is going to be different than if you bought gas from somebody else, right? And they'll spend money on advertising, fancy signs, right? All these other things to essentially differentiate their product. Most markets we see, even with products that look like they might be homogenous, the companies try to convince you my product is a little bit different because of X, Y, and Z, right? And if I can do that, I'm gaining some monopoly power, which will do what? Increase the price I can charge. If I haven't had to spend a lot of money to do it, then also increasing profits. Now, what we can end up, if every company has the same incentive, we all spend money to convince consumers our products are different, but then what do consumers realize? They're all the same. What's happened to the price I can get away with charging? It hasn't changed, but what did I do? Spend a bunch of money on advertising. That was in a situation where we ended up in a national equilibrium. That's a prisoner's dilemma, where now all companies are worse off, right? So like in my eyeglass example, if I was like a company, I would actually try to convince the government to make advertising for my product illegal, right? And I think for a long time, there's some evidence that maybe medical companies were doing this. Like now you see ads for like Anthem, Blue Cross, things like that. They used to not be able to run ads. Well, why? Because these other new health insurance companies, they can't run ads to let you know that they exist, what's the current level of competition? It's going to be lower, which means the existing companies are going to have more monopoly power, able to charge higher prices, have higher profits, keeping other companies out, right? Making these legal barriers to entry by prohibiting advertisement in these different sectors, okay? So I know that's a lot. I think I'm just trying to kind of capstone the class here in this class. So the first half of the class is probably more of the questions I would expect you to be able to answer. What we covered since that in-class quiz, just trying to get your brains thinking, right? Trying to connect the dots a little bit more. I'm not going to be asking like specific questions on how can a company, what's the optimal marketing strategy or things like that. But we're starting to think about how you could use the tools in this class. If you then take like a marketing class later on, you can kind of reuse some of these same principles there, okay? So after class today, after my next section, Module 13 quiz, last Canvas discussion. Next week, we will start review, just do review in class next Tuesday and Thursday. Other than that, have a fun, safe weekend. Try to stay warm, and I will see you on Tuesday.